Hi, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, we're taking a historical, cultural, comics loving view. I have comics historian and author Alex Grand on with me. Alex, thank you so much for jumping on and joining.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'll mention you're the author of Understanding Superhero Comics from McFarland. I'm a fan of McFarland and a fan of the work that they do, and also enjoy your work a great deal with them.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's great. Yeah, that was a project that was about, I guess, 7 years in the making, putting that
Yeah.
together. But it was definitely fulfilling getting it done. I'm really excited that McFarland picked it up. They're more in kind of an academic kind of pop culture kind of thing. But this
Mm-hmm.
was a nice way to kind of fuse it into something that seemed like the right way for me to approach the topic. So yeah, it turned to a good pairing, I felt, with me and the publisher.
Yeah, yeah. That I think that's what I appreciate most about what they publish and about the book is that it's informed, it's researched. There's definitely time that you've spent on it, but it's still readable. There's so many academic texts that are good and they're high quality, but it's almost like they push the accessibility for no really good reason at all. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that about your work and about what they publish.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for hearing that. Or thanks for telling me that. It's great for me to hear that. It's
Hmm.
interesting you say that. One of my coworkers, who's not a comics person, but a smart person, um, picked it up and read it over his week vacation and told me that it was nice. He felt like I explained things, that there's context for everything I'm introducing. He didn't feel like it was a boring list of facts, that there was context and a narration and
Hmm.
building levels to understanding what was going on with superhero comic books. So that it was nice to see that from someone that doesn't know anything about comics and still could connect with it. And so I appreciate you saying that, because that was the goal, was to try to make that whole concept and all that information accessible and fun for people who don't know about superhero comics, and for people who know it really well and still
Hmm.
find something new and a different take on it. So that was the overall goal. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that. And so I imagine you have a history as a reader. So curious about that history and what that readership has been like for you.
Yeah. So I started reading comics at around 4 years old. I was into the mini comics for that came with toys like He-Man and whatnot.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was just so amazing that there was a whole nother universe to explain these characters, and why am I holding these figures, and what's their backstory, and what's their fight all about. And so that's what started me on all that. And then just reading normal books too, like Animal Farm, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or whatever. Those were also important to me. Those are my two favorite books, actually.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
but in the comic world, it turned into kind of studying. It turned into a weird study, because Marvel, they were so good with continuity that I was really just so curious. The Marvel Universe handbook. How many
Hmm.
tons can Thor bench press? All that. Getting that, rating it all, and looking at that universe, and then going back and reading, the Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko stuff, the John Romita stuff. It gave me a framework. So then when I can go look at the old stuff, it wasn't so overwhelming. I can kind of piece it together. And then when I would read little bio histories of each of the superheroes, go back and read, and I'd say, so that's where they got that part of the biographic part of that character from. So
Hmm.
it made
Hmm.
the old stuff accessible, the Silver Age stuff, then the Bronze Age stuff, stuff that was coming out before I was born. I was born in 78. So I was reading all that stuff, as kind of a Johnny come lately kind of guy,
Hmm.
catching up on Marvel Masterworks and whatever else. And then also reading DC, reading Batman when Batman 1989 came out. That was a whole other thing. Like, okay,
Hmm.
now I need to go into DC, and now let's figure DC comics out. So, and the Superman, Christopher Reeve and Linda Carter Wonder Woman, I loved those as a kid. So it was kind of nice to see all the characters interact in the comics, because you didn't really get that in the movies, at least not at that point. And
Hmm.
so getting that in a Justice League comic, it's like, okay, well, they're all actually hanging out in this. So this is where all that wish fulfillment would happen, was in the comics, because the movies weren't really up to doing that yet. So it turned into a big reading, you know, frenzy for me, just catching up. I always felt like had to catch up, and I always felt like there's something more to read. Go to the comic store, get another 10 back issues, read those, catch up on it.
When you mentioned that idea of context and how important that is for your work, and that makes total sense because it's this unfolding, sprawling mythology, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I'm with you on the media portrayals, especially in the 80s and 90s. You would get glimpses of the
Yeah.
stories, but there was so much more there to explore.
Oh yeah. And like things like when Supergirl came out, we knew the movie, with gosh, I forget her name offhand, but
Helen Slater, yeah.
Helen Slater.
hmm
And first she was very beautiful, and tall and all that. And then, when she sees a poster of Christopher Reeve saying, "That's my cousin," I'm like, okay, this is cool. She's talking to a poster of him, not the actual guy. But I was like, okay, this is great, because I love the Christopher Reeve stuff.
Yeah.
As a kid, I liked that movie. It felt connected. I was like imagining a connection, but I finally got it in the comics, and that's where a lot of that fun stuff happened, right? Where especially like, seeing Crisis on Infinite Earths coming out and the Dark Phoenix saga, and you find that when these characters did come together, the human drama, the superhuman drama, was next level drama. Like you didn't get that on TV at all. And it was a soap opera, but with so many science fiction, fantasy, monster elements, romance elements. It's superheroes have developed from the gold age. Just another thing in the book I wrote is that they start as that basic genre. Those three, superpowers, mission for justice, but code name, costume. And my friend Pete Coogan came up with those three basic. He wrote a whole book to prove that those are the three things you need to be a superhero, and that's good. But there's a development, and there's a development from that though. And so what happened with the superhero comic books and their narrative over time was they had to incorporate other things to it, other things that you generally found in other genres too. And so you had to incorporate, some like Wolverine. That's kind of a Western character, actually.
True.
He's more of a cowboy. He's if you look at once you go to Dark Phoenix saga, a lot of the Kree Skrull War. Now you got science fiction. That's sci-fi now. That's like Star Trek. And so they had to incorporate that stuff to become more interesting. And the more genres they incorporated, the more complex they got. And then they started to incorporate the basic humanistic aspects of being a human being over time. So it wasn't just this, super character with no real interest, with no real significant backstory, and not very complex. That stuff got old. That stuff got old in the late 40s to make room for the other genres like the romance or whatever. For superheroes to exist, they had to become more realistic, and also to exist while there was a comics code, while after the Frederick Wertham induced hysteria that had people burn up comics of other genres, leaving room only for superheroes. But then they had to then get all the good stuff from those other genres so that could thrive in the comic book industry. And it comes down to that initial idealistic superhero. Then with Julius Schwartz, you have more of a humanistic approach. You have someone who's surprised by their powers, who's discovering it with the reader. There's a bit of a humility. There's more humility now. In the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, now there is a flawed character, an imperfect character, someone that, hey, maybe I should just take the bribe and not fight the guy. Maybe I should, maybe I should, for example, like Thor, right? He was a cripple in his daily life, and so there was always a weakness. There was always some flaw. They were not perfect. The Thing always got upset. Mr. Fantastic, kind of arrogant, talked down to people, pissed people off. People got upset at the way he talked, and so that was that flawed, imperfect character. And then the introduction of mortality, and that's the Jim Starlin death effect. Introducing mortality, not being able to prevent death. You can minimize it, but there'll still be a whole bunch of planets because you didn't act fast enough. They're all dead because you didn't act fast enough. And heroes have to deal with that with Thanos. And then after the fear of death, then comes the selfish superhero, and that's more that Alan Moore, the deconstructed superhero, that in the real world, if you want to get real, they're selfish, superpowered jerks that have no empathy toward the human condition at all. So it was that arc of human degradation. As I was putting all that together historically, I realized I can actually do a chronological history of the origins of the superhero comic book, and then how they changed over time using the human narrative, the human degradation narrative arc for the book. And once that all kind of clicked for me, and that struggle for superhero realism and trying to get them more real and more real and more real, that I realized, like, okay, I can make a history book out of this that can carry a reader through it and still be engaging and approach it in a human way that everyone could relate to those kind of qualities. And that's what I was basically going for.
Yeah, yeah, and you accomplish it well, and even your talk through there is very insightful of sort of recapping some of that as well. I feel like a lot of what I do in my work in literacy is legitimizing comics, speaking to the possibilities of comics, both superhero comics and comics more broadly. So curious about the role that you feel like comics play as part of culture and as cultural works.
Well, in a way, that element of human degradation, over the years, over like 100-year span of comics anyway, of comic books, and where they end up. And then in the 80s becoming real, and then more extreme in the 90s. Then after that, now recycling, reusing all those other elements to try to reapproach it and modernize it. I think all that is a reflection of where the American consciousness is at the time. I think that there are very real world ramifications that cause these reflections in where America's at these times. I think America felt more idealistic during World War II. There was a cause, and they were the heroes of the world, or we felt. I wasn't alive then, but there was an American sense that war, fighting that war under FDR, was a good war. There's an idealism there. And then I think that the 50s and science fiction and trying to break things down, the ramifications of the atom bomb, why are things this way, breaking it down, I think all that mixes with that humanistic approach of, I have science-based powers, electricity, chemicals mixed, and now I have super speed. I want to experiment with that speed, almost like a scientist. That's the Julius Schwartz 50s mentality. And if you look at a lot of movies around that time, there's a lot of science fiction movies. It's a reflection of where the mind was at as a post-atomic bomb kind of era. And in the 60s, it was civil rights movement. There were a lot of things going on, making America question itself, America acknowledging that it had flaws. And I think that reflected well in the 60s Marvel characters, that they had flaws too. That's why it worked, because it was where America was at. And if you look at the post-Vietnam War mortality, not being able to prevent the deaths that happened, losing that war, all the soldiers that died, and there was nothing, they got drafted, died. We couldn't do anything about it, no matter how powerful we were. That reflects in the superhero struggle against Thanos, the bringer of death. That's Jim Starlin, as a veteran, having a post-war way of approaching and processing the emotions he had in his character. And when you also have the selfish superhero, that's a reflection of 80s. And, you know, look, I love the 80s, but I was a kid. I loved He-Man. I love all that stuff. But at the same time, if you compare it to some of the previous decades, there was more of a materialistic essence of the 80s. It was a commercial hit. The economy was great, but everyone wanted stuff. Everyone wanted things. And so there was a certain sense of using your power for selfish things. And that does reflect in the selfish characters like the comedian or Dr. Manhattan, who was not necessarily selfish, but he was self-involved, didn't really much care. He'd rather play with sand than help anyone, and play with sand on Mars or whatever. So all that stuff is a reflection of what was going on in society. And that's why it all matched. And if you look at it in a way, it's a metaphor for other sorts of things. Music kind of goes, rock isn't what it was. It changed. It became more realistic, became more raw, became this, that. You know, that's different than the 50s rock, that was a little bit different. So America has done that in all its art forms. Movies have done that too, right? So the
Mhm.
70s movies, there were a lot more. If you look at Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma and whoever, these movies are a lot more raw and real than some of the ones from the 40s and the 50s that had more of an idealization to their characters. So everything has done that. It's based, comics are a reflection of the American psychological experience.
It makes me think, where are we now based on
Right.
comics that are being published? That's an interesting thought to think through. Um, so as you've been sort of more deeply connecting with the world of comics and as you've been on this historical and cultural journey, anything that's been particularly surprising to you as you've worked on this?
Well, yeah, because there are a lot of things that I kind of thought, social media and using that to learn.
Mhm,
You
mhm,
can use it to learn. I mean, it's there to learn, but what I realized when I did this, because I got my citations, I have 1,200 citations. I researched every little assumption that I thought was true.
mhm,
And I disproved myself on like 6, 7 different things. I was like, okay, that was wrong. And I realized that a lot of that social media knowledge, you got to take some of that with a grain of salt, because you have emotions running behind a lot of this stuff on social media, and a lot of things get distorted. People say, oh yeah, this guy once said this. Okay, well, where did they say that? Oh, I don't know. Okay, what? So when you actually do look up that stuff, you find that maybe something slightly different was actually said. And
mhm, mhm,
so the whole thing was a big lesson to me on social media is a great tool to kind of begin, but be skeptical of everybody. There's agenda everywhere, and you really want to look up everything that's being talked about. If it's enough to make you angry, then you better research it first and not get
mhm,
angry. Save the anger for later once you put all your facts together,
mhm,
because you can get your emotions manipulated, your sense of what actually happened manipulated. And so that's, I think, the whole point of approaching this academically. I disproved some of my own thoughts, and so that was eye opening, using citations to back up everything you say. In the end of the day, it wasn't a vanity project. It wasn't about what I feel about
mhm,
things. It
mhm,
was about me putting together all the information that I read, and I read a lot. And I my bibliography and citations are like 60 pages, but using a lot of that research and putting it all together into this project that's substantiated. And I think that's what was the key, was how important that is to be able to substantiate what your overall point of what your writing is.
mhm, mhm. Absolutely. And I love that message of critical reading and critical thinking as
Yeah. Oh,
well.
yeah. Yeah, because social media, I mean, you can fall for some traps if you don't do that.
Absolutely. So last official question, and then we can hit anything that we've missed, and that is the future. What do you envision that might be on the horizon for the comics industry, the comics medium?
Well, the whole question is competing media. I think
Hmm. Hmm.
comics were huge in World War II, right? Some of the biggest, that's I think the biggest circulation. That was because weren't competing media. There was radio, I guess, but it wasn't, that's not visual. And they had comic strips in the newspapers, but that's kind of a different thing.
Hmm.
But when TV hit, sales boom. Actually, once the war was over, sales went down. Then when TV came in the 50s, that then they went down again. And then in the 60s there was some kind of the same media, but then and then you have distribution issues, direct market. Okay, fine, we're kind of back, but then you have internet, and then you have iPads, and then you have um uh you know I streaming, and
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that changes everything. YouTube, TikTok, you know, people are not getting their morning funnies from comic strips in the newspapers. They're getting it from their TikTok. All
Hmm.
these homemade 20-second bits. And hey, it's all good. I get it. Like I'm on there too. But that's what I mean is it's competing media.
Mhm.
So how do comic books actually compete with other media? Now, superheroes, a lot of Marvel and DC's answer has been get those characters into other media.
Mhm.
Also, get
Right,
those
right.
stories into other media, expand into other media to try to keep these characters relevant. So get them in TV, movies. Let's put them on board games. They've been doing that for a long time, but let's get a Marvel TikTok and put stuff on there. Let's get a Marvel YouTube, get some stuff on there, get programming, get these characters out there in all those other competing media. So at least the characters will kind of carry the company in other media. So I definitely see an emphasis in other media. Now, comic books themselves, that becomes an interesting question because, what's the age range? And if there is, you know, a demographic age range, you got to appeal to that age range. Now, if that
Mhm.
age range is still 11 to 17, and that 11 to 17-year-old struggle is different than, let's say, someone my age, you got to tailor the comics to that 11 to 17-year-old, if that is the highest number of people buying it, percentage wise. Now, if it's
Mhm.
split pretty evenly, well, that's pretty hard because before it was a lot easier. It was a lot easier to focus to 11 to 17-year-olds only. And they kind of were the same. They just wanted to be a little more raw each generation. That's easy. Now, if we have more of a wider distribution, now you're trying to appeal to everybody, maybe a little something different here, but it's hard. It's hard to please a fandom that is easily split, and that's a reality. How do you approach that?
Mhm.
Gender dysphoria, that's a reality that happens. Now you put that in, now other people who are collecting don't want to read it. So how do you please everybody? So I think the comic book industry, it's tough. It's great as far as trying out IP, so to make it into TV and film. I think that's going to be the bigger emphasis, is um as some sort of think tank for
Mhm.
the TV and films. That's what I think really is it's going to head toward. Uh, Unfortunately, there's a lot of ways of reading those comics that come out every month for free. So how do you
Mhm.
sustain an economy like that? Even with the writer's strike, the Screen Actors Guild strike, a lot of that stuff, it's like a buffet, right?
Mhm.
Buffet.
Right.
So everyone's paying that flat thing and they're eating everything they want. Well, how do you make money from that? How do you sustain an economy with a buffet model? And so I feel like everything's going to get tailored toward this buffet thing, maybe Marvel Unlimited, whatever, but it's going to be harder for, let's say, writers, artists to come in and actually make the money that they did before. So I think it's going to become more of like the love for the business, but also you're going to have to then be able to, have an agent, get into the Writers Guild, also write movies, also write other things. I think everything's going to become other media dependent. If comic books are to survive, even though they may sell less of them over time, they will function at least at the minimum as a think tank for other media. And I think it's just going to have to be to keeping up with expanding technologies that way.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really prescient response given just the way that so many stories are available in so many formats. Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and it's all about the story, and it's all about the story, and just put it out in whatever media that the public wants, and the Marvel and DC have to keep up with that. What does that do to the art form? It means there's going to be some indie publishers, people that are willing to put down 20 grand to make a graphic novel, and and then there'll be some indie things you can now sell on demand. You can print on demand now on Amazon and other publishers, on Barnes and Noble, all that. It's not hard to do that. So be a lot more indie things, a lot more self-paid things that are out there,
mhm,
with
mhm,
hopes with hopes that they'll make a movie deal out of them. And so that's going to happen. Marvel DC may not stay as powerful as they'd like. They'll still probably be the main ones because they're backed by large corporations who have other media at their disposal. And so they'll probably still be the main ones. But then you'll have also other independent indie publishers pumping out a bunch of things also on the side. And it'll be, instead of all focused toward those two, it'll be more spread out.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, in our last few minutes, I want to say thank you for matching the background. We have matching backgrounds. I really appreciate that. I think you're the first person that's been on the
Woo!
podcast. Exactly.
Yes.
I love it. I love it. Almost looks like we're in the same room.
Yeah,
Um,
I like that. It's like we're in the same library, just having a conversation over the table here.
that's
We're
right. I
taking a
love it.
study break, having a little talk.
I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. Um, so any projects, ideas that you're currently circling that you'd like to mention before we wrap the
Yeah.
talk?
I've done a couple graphic novels. I did one called Journey to Mexico. It's a kind of a supernatural superhero Mexican history graphic novel that's on Amazon. Takes place in the 1830s. It's kind of esoteric, but I'd like to think I made a fun project out of it. A lot of fun monsters and monster fights in it. Then I did another one called Hash Man with one of my friends about his dad, who was a big uh, you know, legalized marijuana force, but also illegal in the early days. And
Hmm.
that's another graphic novel, Hash Man. They're both historical in some sense because they have some truth in them. That of things that actually happened. And then I'm working on a third one. I can't talk about it yet with another buddy of mine, but I will release more information on that when it becomes closer toward the final printing. It's still in progress, but I'm excited about working on that. It's nice to work on comics. Um, Especially after writing a book like this, because it was like 360 pages, my history book, and it was like citation, and it was all there's a narrative, there's a thesis there, and it was, I did like 12 rewrites, right? But
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
nice to actually do a visual comic and have fun with it and brainstorm with my co-writer and have fun with it. And it's nice to do that. So that's probably more my interest in the foreseeable future. Um,
Great, great.
but I'll wait till the year uh 2100, and then the next 100 years of comics love it, then I'll write part two of my book.
There you go. There you go. Looking forward to it. Yeah, yeah. Live long and prosper. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Alex. Thanks for
Yeah,
coming
thanks.
on. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for all of the thoughtful responses and insights, and looking forward to reading more.
Thank you. Great to be here. I appreciate it. This was wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. Great to talk with you.